Podcasting from the heart of the Gator Nation in Alachua County, Florida, this is Extension Cord, the podcast of IFAS Extension Alachua County, where we plug in and bring IFAS Extension to life. Good afternoon. This is Dr. Taylor Clem with IFAS Extension in Alachua County. Today we're going to talk about summer vegetable gardening, and joining us today we have one of our Master Gardener volunteers, Scott Schuppie. Scott, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Taylor.
So you've been a Master Gardener volunteer with Alachua County for how long now?
Oh man, you're making me think. So I'm in my, I've been doing this for, it's either 3 or 4 years. I want to say it's 3. I think it's the 2007. That was the class of 2017.
Okay, wonderful. And I know one of the roles that you've taken on, so anybody that's tuned in, if you follow us on our social media page, you probably see Master Gardener Scott. He's one of our contributors on our page. You probably see his name pop up periodically. But Scott is also, obviously a gardening enthusiast, especially a vegetable gardener. So Scott, I know you, and I know that you really like vegetable gardening. Tell me a little bit about what you do in your yard with vegetable gardening, and how you, what are the types of things that you like to grow, etc.
Well, it's been interesting for me since becoming a master gardener. My family has really transitioned. My neighbors laugh at me because I always will say, 2 down, 1 to go, meaning my children were becoming empty nesters. So what's very interesting, as my last child is graduating from school here, kind of, sort of this year. So we'll be becoming empty nesters. So my garden has actually been somewhat my vegetable gardens have been somewhat shrinking because I don't need to produce as much as I used to.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Because we're simply not eating as much as a family of 5 would eat. Mm-hmm. Now I'm gardening kind of for a family of 3. So I have gone from, and I don't know if you, Taylor, have seen some of the pictures of my old backyard where I had a huge amount of production going on. Especially my oldest child went to culinary school and became a chef here in town.
Oh, perfect.
And I started growing production crops of, especially in the winter season, onions and lettuces, different lettuces and spinach and those type of things. For his restaurant, the restaurant that he was working at, I was selling them.
Oh, wonderful.
That product. So that was nice. And I got a tremendous amount of experience about how to grow that type of crop in a production more so than just a family vegetable garden, which is kind of what I'm at now. I'm running three raised beds that are 4 feet wide by 8 feet long and 16 inches deep, and then one that is 3 feet wide that is the same 8 feet long. And then I have a skinny one for my strawberries and potatoes that is 2 feet wide, but it's 16 feet long. Mm-hmm. And I get a crop out of that. So it's interesting. My backyard has changed quite a bit with regards to that. And it really only consumes half of my backyard now. The other half is donated completely to my chickens.
All right.
Yeah, which there is no crop in the chicken area anymore because they have decimated the lawn that used to be there.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
But the things that I'm growing in the summertime are really kind of interesting because our climate is really it's very interesting. I know a lot of people, especially recently, I've noticed running the social media page, the Facebook page for a couple of years, solely myself. There's been a lot of people that have moved to this part of Florida from either way up north or from South Florida, and both of those transplants, I'll call them, are I get similar questions from both because the climate is very different here, and especially in the summertime.
Yeah, and I know, like you mentioned earlier, that you're primarily growing vegetable crops, or like you're growing things as winter crops, like your greens, etc. Um, and I think, I mean, that brings us to the crux of our conversation today. Is, you mentioned it, transplants, people from other parts of the country moving here. We quickly learn that gardening is completely different. It's completely different in how individuals grow food, the timing in which they plant. So that's why we're having this conversation today. Like I said, let's talk a little bit about climate. Because you mentioned climate. Why is it the climate has such an impact on those crops?
If you think about how the spring kind of arrives, and this year has been even actually different from the last, even say 5, 6, 10 years.
Yeah.
Where we've actually kind of had a real spring. What we've had in the past is, we go from freeze warnings in early March to 90 degrees in late March. So it's that growing season it throws a lot of people off, especially if you're not from here, especially if you're not used to it. And when I started really kind of growing, I started really getting back into gardening roughly about 10 or 12 years ago now. After the 2008 debacle, economic debacle kind of in our country, I started putting my feet back into really gardening because I've always loved it. I mean, I grew up gardening. I was, taught gardening by my grandparents and my parents, and they were all very avid gardeners. And but I learned that science or that methodology growing up I grew up in Wisconsin, so the climate is dramatically different. Mm-hmm. Where this time of year there's a possibility of snow still growing up.
Right.
So, we always start. Now, I was fortunate that my parents had a greenhouse, so we would always have starts in the greenhouse. We would start planting in late March, but we wouldn't move those things out until the end of May is when we actually put them into the soil. So that was very different. Now, we're here. I still have that same practice kind of, but my starts are in January.
Right.
Where I'll be starting things either indoors or in the greenhouse. And I have a very small, greenhouse that we can get away with here in North Florida. But the climate is so different in that a lot of people that are from here, especially from up north, but I also get it from the folks down south or on the West Coast, and they're like, I'm used to starting my tomatoes and putting them in the ground on the 1st of January. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, oh yeah, well you can do that, but those seeds you're probably going to experience a frost and you're going to kill those young plants.
So many people are so used to growing tomatoes in like when I was growing vegetables up north, you'd grow tomatoes or green beans, some of your greens, and you'd be growing them through the summer. But, here in Alachua County, because of, frost, but also just our hot summers, humid summers, it has a huge limit on what we can grow because the temperature and the climate conditions is just too much for a lot of the plants like a tomato, because we're now technically too late to plant most of our tomatoes or some heat-tolerant varieties, some like cherry tomatoes. So
right, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
There's only a very few vegetable crops that I will grow in the summertime. I'll grow peppers.
Uh-huh.
So if you have a love for the Anaheims and the Poblanos and Scotch bonnets and Thai chilies and those types of things, or the New Mexican, more about that. If you love Christmas sauce,
yeah.
If you love the Christmas sauce, that pepper will grow here.
Yeah. We grew some at the extension office last year with the New Mexican hatch green chili, and in New Mexico, the state question is red, green, or Christmas, and that's all from those green chilies.
Yeah.
I was so excited that we grew those.
Yeah, no, I believe that. So, for people that are listening, if you're looking for something to start now, you can start those types of things. You could start eggplants because eggplant will make it through the summers here. But other than that, then you get into some more unique stuff. And I have only grown and more of an experimental kind of stuff. Like, hey, I got to try to figure out what will grow in the summertime here, and I've grown some stuff because a lot of the things that are really challenging here in the summertime, it's not just the weather, but pests and weeds and
right.
disease all thrive in this humidity and hot that we have. So it's very challenging to grow, and that's why I suggest to people. And here, the main thing that I grow now. My wife absolutely. She'd divorce me if I didn't grow eggplants in the summertime because she absolutely loves eggplant. And I love my wife, so I grow them. And we eat a lot of eggplant parmesan. And imagine every Italian dish that you can think of that has eggplant. And I have to make that for my wife, who is Irish, by the way. She's not Italian, but she loves eggplant.
Yeah.
So go figure that out. But my main crop in the summertime is when I get in my full-fledged, all-on, very thick mat of cover crop. And this year, I can tell you, I'm growing. My cover crop is going to consist of velvet bean, millet. Oh gosh, darn it all! I can't think of hairy vetch, which doesn't do great in the summer here, but I want that as a nitrogen fixer.
Right.
And then.
Well, let's go back.
I can't.
I want to go back. You're talking about the cover crops. So we're limited based off of what we can grow. Based off of climate, just too hot in the summer to a certain extent to grow something. So we are limited. Like, if we were to talk about like what are some common recommendations of what you can plant this time of year. Some of the very common ones that you can plant in May are sweet potatoes, Swiss chard, okra, and some peas like the southern peas. Those are ones in this North Florida that we can grow this time of year. Like if you're just looking at that same list, only really sweet potatoes you can grow down in South Florida. So there are plants that we can grow in our vegetable gardens, but a lot of time, you just mentioned that it's not necessarily growing food production or having some type of food production in our yard. So you mentioned the cover crops. That's the millet, the vetch. What was the other ones that you mentioned?
Well, and here's the stuff that I've used in the past.
Yeah.
In the summertime, I've tried some sun hemp, which is I would say this: you get it grows well. I mean, it will all of a sudden you'll turn around after it starts raining in June and July, and by the end of July you'll have 4 feet of yellow flowers all over your sun hemp, and then you got to get rid of it because you don't want it to go to seed.
Right.
But the problem with sun hemp is if you cut it, all of a sudden it is going to be sun hemp is very fibrous. So it takes a long time to break down. If you're going to use and the reason I use a cover crop is it's green manure to me.
Right.
So I don't get rid of it.
Can you explain a little bit like what you're doing with these cover crops? So we refer to them as green manure, and we use them as cover crops because they grow well in the summer. But why do we want to do that, and what is it?
Yeah, but a cover crop, and we call green manure, is a crop that is going to help us build soil. That's really the purpose that I use it for, to feed the soil food web, to feed the base of it, the foundation. That's kind of what I look at it as. It's the foundation of the soil food web because it's recycling minerals out of our soil, putting it back in the soil, and it's helping, all those digesters, the bacteria, and all the way up the soil food web. So the arthropods and, everything that's involved in that, the earthworms. What I'm doing is I'm growing a crop not to maturity. I'm just growing a crop for let's just say that it has a 60 or 75 day maturity, whatever it happens to be. And then I will, well before that time period, and I'll typically put my cover crops in June, and I'll chop them down by the end of July. Now, why am I doing that? Well, I'll have a 45-day crop, so I'll have a pretty good stand of whatever it is I'm growing. And I never monoculture. I'll always grow like 4 or 5 different things mixed in together across all of my beds. But then I'll chop them down, and I'll literally chop it down. I don't till. I will chop them off as close to the surface of the soil as I can get it, and I use a hedge clippers to do that. And then I lay everything down, okay, and I just let it sit there and let the sun beat it up and let the rain start to soak it in, and it gets a little messy, to be honest with you. But then in August, about the second week of August, I will finish an enormous amount of compost will start to come to maturity for me from the leaves that drop in the spring. And I'll start covering all those cover crops with that compost. And that is going to start energizing that soil food web, because you're just putting another layer on, and that very rapidly will start to break down that green manure into its, all of its parts and pieces, and it will start to help build your soil. Now, does it completely decompose by the time I'm starting to plant my fall and winter crops in September and October? No, but I'm just going to simply plant into it.
So it's important that, like, you're mentioning that this breaks down. So you're using these cover crops and you're knocking them down, and it helps. It's just like you're building compost in your bed, essentially, in a nutshell. And you're breaking it down, and it helps feed the soil, it helps build the soil, because it helps your plants in the future have a stronger soil conditions in which they can grow, so they actually can do a little bit better. You're talking about soil moisture retention. You're talking about nutrient availability to the plants when they start to grow in the future. And I mean, green manure works. It helps significantly. Yeah.
Yeah, it helps. It also helps with weed suppression.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. But say I am say I travel back and forth between the year. And you mentioned diversification within your soil, or with those those cover crops that you're using. That immediately makes me think that, about nematode issues. You don't rotate the types of plants that you have in your vegetable garden, and eventually you develop root knot nematodes, and they can have major impacts on the quality of your garden and the productivity of it. So I know that many people travel throughout the summer and don't have the ability to maintain gardens, or they don't want to. So it's important that we can take advantage of that summer heat and take a downtime in our garden, possibly by solarizing our gardens. Do you solarize your garden at all?
I have done that just to have the experience of doing that, and I've done it to 2 of my beds. And the way that I do it is, and the way that I've done it, just to understand, how it works. And I'm a great believer in, I can read something in a book and I can understand what the book is telling me, but I don't have the full knowledge of whatever it is until I do it myself.
Yeah.
I'm just one of those people. Okay. So basically it's very simple, and you don't have to have a raised bed to solarize soil.
Right. Right.
You can, all it is you're taking a piece of plastic it can be clear, and you're going to lay it over the surface of the soil that you want to solarize. But what's important is you need to weight it down.
Yes.
Now some of it's going to get weighted down from rain that will sit on top of it. But when I did it on my beds, I did it with stones and cement blocks, cinder blocks around the edges, and I stretched that piece of, I just went to a big box store and bought big piece of, kind of that cloudy plastic and stretch it across my bed and then weight it down. And what that really did, and now here, this is how I did this, because it was an experiment for me. I grew a cover crop, but I let that cover crop get only maybe 3 inches tall, and I cut it, and then I covered it to solarize to see, well, will that decompose fast, et cetera.
Right.
And I went away for the entire, from, I can remember, I went away from the last week of July until the third week of August that year, and then came back, because that's like the worst time to be in Florida, because it's so dang hot and humid and sticky, and
sometimes you don't want to work outside in the summer heat. It's just so hot.
Right,
Yeah.
Right.
100% humidity. Yeah.
Exactly. It's bad hair days. Unfortunately, I don't have any because I don't have any hair, but that's what those are.
And I think it's important to note, like what you just mentioned about solarization, our best time to do it is June, July, and August, because you need it to run a certain period of time. And if you are going to solarize, essentially what it's doing is you want to lay down a clear plastic so light can actually get through, and it heats up the soil more or less, and then it helps, I don't want to say necessarily completely eliminate the nematode population. I think that's impossible, but it significantally reduces that population because it's very difficult to get rid of nematodes, and they're microscopic. You can't see them with the naked eye. But the clear plastic allows light to get through and helps heat up that soil, so it helps control that population. And like if you use like a black plastic, the light can't get through it. It gets really hot, but just on the surface, not in the soil. So translucent's going to be the best for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And here, it's to be a little bit of a science nerd, sorry. And really what it is the translucent, you said it. That's really important because it allows for shortwave radiation to penetrate.
To get through. Yeah.
Yes. And that is lethal to if you got nematodes that are right on the soil surface. And it's funny because a lot of people don't realize, you said this too, they're microscopic. So typical in our Florida soil, if you pick up a handful of soil, so you picture yourself holding a handful of soil, you might have, 500 million nematodes in your hand.
They're everywhere.
It's the concept. Yes, it's unavoidable here. So, and here, even if, like I say to people ask me, well, do you have a nematode problem in a raised bed? And I'll say, well, not yet. That's because they got 16 inches to go before I'm going to have a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I put barriers down and stuff, but they're coming. It's just an unavoidable fact of gardening here in Florida.
Right. Yeah. Because and one of the ways that we can, solarization is a great way to help control nematode population, especially in the summer, because there's limited that we can really grow. You can do the green manures or a few of the different types of crops, but it gives you a way that if you want to avoid the heat, you can cover your gardens and come back later. But, another way to help control nematodes is just to, every time you plant something, plant it in like a different location in your garden, rotate your plants around. Because the minute that you start planting plants in the same location, those like vegetable, fruit crops, whatever it is that you're growing, that ends up becoming an attractor to those nematodes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's just a general. Yeah, it's just a general best management practice. But I know, solarization is great, but there's some other common things. So, like or at least that can happen in our gardens in the summer. So, like the heat, the humidity, the rain, the moisture, it all comes in. So that brings, and you mentioned way earlier, different funguses, or fungi that can pop up. Yeah. So that's why I think, it's important to mention integrated pest management. Integrated pest management being the how do you control the pest in your landscape, which doesn't necessarily restrict itself to insects, but that can be fungus or other type of disease that could pop up. But in our summer, our humidity and our moisture is just so high that we become a hotbed for different types of fungi to grow. We see that in our landscapes, our ornamental plants, our vegetable gardens. So it's always really important to make sure that you scout regularly. Look out for the issues before they become problematic. But Scott, when we talk about fungi or funguses that you may have outbreaks within your vegetable garden, what's some of the first things that you do when you notice an issue?
Well, I take I'll call it a layered approach. And what I mean by that is, depending on, because I travel a lot in the summertime, or I'm gone frequently, if you get something early, then you don't have to take as dramatic or drastic a step. So
correct.
Anybody that can do some research, and one of the things that I would encourage everybody to do as a gardener here in Florida, if you have a question, and you can always call our Master Gardener help desk, but another easy thing to do is you can go to Google and type whatever your question is in, and then after it, in all capital letters, put IFAS.
Mm-hmm.
And what Google's going to kick back to you things that are very pertinent to whatever it happens to be. You're going to get some access to the library, the IFAS and the EDIS library. So let's address that in this perspective. You're going to go to a big box store and you're going to get copper sulfate. You're going to put, and that if you have a very bad fungus problem, even copper sulfate sometimes won't eliminate that.
Mm-hmm.
And using copper sulfate, Taylor, I'm sure you're very well aware, but our listeners might not. If you're going to use copper sulfate, you definitely want to have gloves, and you want to use old clothes, because if you spray it and you get it on yourself, you're going to look like a Smurf because it's very blue and it stains. Okay. Now I'm speaking from experience.
Yeah. Anytime that we apply any type of fungicide or insecticide or anything pesticide, it's always important to follow the label, and they have like different personal protection equipment instructions on all those depending on what it is. So that's why I always require or recommend people to read the label on anything that they spray in their gardens.
And that goes for that's just not fungicide, but that goes for insecticide, pesticide, any herbicide. It doesn't matter if you're going to take a chemical approach and
apply it
sometimes
in the garden.
that is yes.
There's no one size fit all solution for anything, but what we can do is, especially going back to talking about specifically the summer landscapes, what we can do is scout regularly. Look at what are the different strategies or what are those different resources that we have available to us to help diagnose any issues that we have within our garden. And you mentioned the Master Gardener Volunteer Help Desk, and that's a great resource for anybody within our community to reach out to. If you have any issues, you can share photos, and we'll try to figure out the best solution or the solution to whatever's happening within that garden or within their landscape. But Scott, we're creeping up on our time that we have together. But what I wanted to ask is, I know that we could keep talking for quite a long time on this.
What's funny is we were supposed to be, but we were going to talk about what we can grow vegetables. What vegetables do you grow in the summertime? And we've talked about everything but that.
Well, I know. We just mentioned them. But I know, that's why as we head out, I think, we have our summer vegetable garden class that we are doing in this May. And it's an online webinar. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, so anybody can go on there and they can watch a recording of it. And we'll share different publications on what you can and cannot grow, or what does well here. But before we head out, Scott, what I want to ask you is, what are you currently growing in your garden? I know you mentioned your tomatoes and everything, but what do you expect more people to grow in their gardens this year?
Well, this year, for whatever reason, I'm having a very surprisingly pest-free so far. Pest-free so far.
Knock on wood.
Yes, spring. I have actually harvested some cucumbers and have not seen those. I haven't seen the cucumber worms. That's what I call them. I can't think of the specific. I haven't had any vine borers in my zucchini or squash yet. So I'm very optimistic about that, and I'm pulling those crops in now. You mentioned tomatoes. That is my favorite thing to grow. I have yellow neck squash. I have zucchini. I have cucumbers. I have green beans.
Oh, delicious.
Haricots to be exact. Which is the slender French green bean that I personally love those. So we'll see. That's what I'm growing, along with eggplants. My eggplants have started. I'm trying to think of other things. Oh, and peppers. I've got peppers started. I got about 4 or 5 different types of peppers.
Wonderful.
So
wonderful. Well, Scott, I do appreciate it, and I appreciate your time, but that does wrap up our time. But I want to thank you for joining us today, and I know that we're going to have a lot of people tune into the class that we have coming up about summer vegetable gardening. So I think it's going to be a good program that we have a lot of people tune into. We already sold out on it, which is like 100 people. So that's going to be a really nice program to be able to offer to the community and then offer this up to them as well. So
I'm looking forward to conducting that class. It will be very informative. And what's nice is now that we have the YouTube page up, is they'll be able to see it. If you missed the class or you didn't reserve your seat, you can still have a chance to
access
view
it.
The
Absolutely.
presentation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, Scott, thank you very much, and thank you for joining us and for this episode of Extension Cord. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you, everybody.